At the beginning of the 20th century, the fates of two future marshals, Konev and Zhukov, seemed to run parallel. But soon their paths crossed at the epicenter of great trials. Born in different corners of the Russian Empire, from an early age they were aware of their ambitions and inner responsibility for the future of the country, each in his own way. Konev, a native of a village in the Kursk province, entered the army at an early age and went through periods of extremely difficult events, from World War I to the Civil War. Zhukov, on the other hand, grew up in a more educated family in the Kaluga province, which shaped his curiosity and thirst for knowledge, qualities that would later prove invaluable in strategy and tactics. Both men displayed extraordinary tenacity and iron will, but their approaches to military service were completely different. Konev was distinguished by his practicality and sense of human measure. He was able to find common ground with soldiers and officers, creating unusually cohesive formations. Zhukov was more strict and demanding. His tough discipline and desire for complete readiness sometimes made people fear him, but also respect him. This contrast, firmly embedded in the character of each of the marshals, became key to their subsequent rivalry and interaction on the fronts of the Great Patriotic War. Konev gained his first serious combat experience during the Civil War, where he proved himself to be a talented cavalry commander, capable of making quick decisions on the battlefield. His ability to anticipate the enemy's actions and make the most of the terrain earned him the respect of his commanders and comrades. Zhukov began his military career in the artillery and, thanks to his diligence, quickly mastered the complex aspects of military science, which later helped him become one of the best strategists in the Soviet Union. Both men rose rapidly through the ranks, but their paths diverged. Konev was more involved in commanding units focused on mobile and rapid operations, while Zhukov became famous as a master of defensive and counteroffensive operations, especially when his name was associated with the defense of Moscow. The uniqueness of each of them lay in their ability to adapt to the most difficult conditions and find unconventional solutions, which repeatedly proved their superiority over the enemy. Both marshals spent their youth and training during one of the most difficult periods in the country's history. The second half of the 1920s and early 1930s were a time when new military doctrines were being formed, and Konev and Zhukov absorbed the experience of the past, studying tactics and strategy. They were trained at different military academies, where they not only mastered theory, but also took part in training battles. Konev, for example, was known for his deep understanding of cavalry maneuvers, which was extremely important in the context of the coming conflicts, while Zhukov brought innovation to artillery methods and the interaction between different branches of the military. It should be noted that despite some rivalry, there was no open conflict between them in the early years of their careers. On the contrary, they even respected each other's achievements. However, differences in worldview and personal qualities gradually laid the foundation for future contradictions. Initially, Konev was perceived as a man of words and deeds, while Zhukov was seen as an analyst and strict leader. Their shared history could not but be reflected in the events of World War II, where their talents and differences came together. Before the Great Patriotic War, both were already experienced commanders with many achievements and challenges behind them. At that time, they were actively involved in the modernization of the Red Army, reforming not only tactics, but also the morale of the troops. Konev always paid great attention to the spirit of the soldiers. His slogan was unity and courage, while Zhukov demanded unconditional obedience and discipline. This contrast was the essence of their approaches to war and command. It is also important to remember the influence of the ruling circles that supported both marshals at different times. Their professional growth often took place against a backdrop of political intrigue and struggles for influence in the military high command. In these conditions, Konev showed great diplomacy and skill in maneuvering between different factions, while Zhukov built his success on personal authority and an unshakable will to win. This left its mark on the course of events and shaped the myths about them, which sometimes led to distortions of historical truth. Life's trials shaped both of them not only into outstanding commanders, but also into interesting characters, each of whom deserves separate attention. Konev, with his calm confidence and tact, opposed Zhukov with his assertiveness and uncompromising determination. This clash of temperaments enriched Soviet military science and, against the backdrop of future military successes, looked like a battle between the two strongest minds of their era. Thus, Zhukov and Konev came of age in an atmosphere of tension and challenges, each preparing for the coming battles in his own way. Their early successes, serious training, and personal qualities made these men not just commanders, but symbols of the great victory, which they achieved through trials and the formation of their personalities. This path, full of contrasts and unity, was just beginning to unfold on the pages of history, foreshadowing the most important events ahead. Now, having left behind the stages of their formation and first combat flights, it is time to move on to the next period, where these characters will enter into real combat with the enemy, and their differences will become more acute in the conditions of fierce battles. It is there that the drama of their confrontation will unfold in all its fullness and tell us how legends were born. First encounter on the battlefield Moscow, July 1941. At a time when German troops were rapidly approaching the capital, one of the first significant clashes between two great Soviet commanders, Konev and Zhukov, took place. Their paths crossed not simply as appointed commanders, but as masters of strategy, whose interaction would determine the fate of the Western Front. Despite their common goal of defending their homeland from the looming threat, the command styles of these marshals had their own characteristics, which affected the course of operations and the morale of the troops. Konev, young, energetic, and decisive, preferred aggressive maneuvers and surprise attacks. He was not afraid to take risks, believing that active action could turn the tide of battle at the most critical moment. His approach to combat was characterized by determination and a desire to take the initiative, which was especially important in the context of a protracted defense. In contrast, Zhukov was a combination of strict discipline and deep tactical thinking. His strategy was based on a thorough analysis of the situation and the preparation of reserves at appropriate lines, allowing him to redistribute forces as effectively as possible as events unfolded. The first joint operation near Moscow was a real test of strength for both commanders. Positioned on different sections of the front, their armies faced continuous enemy attacks. But cooperation required not only coordination of actions, but also the ability to quickly adapt to changing combat conditions. Despite their differences, Both generals showed mutual respect and a desire to achieve a common victory. In particular, Konev valued Zhukov's experience and strategic thinking, while the latter, in turn, recognized his colleague's intuitive decisiveness. Konev's decision to attack enemy positions at a critical moment, when the defense line was particularly vulnerable, deserves special attention. This counterattack not only held back the advance, but also bought several days of respite to regroup reserves. At the same time, Zhukov repeatedly adjusted the distribution of forces, strengthening weak sections of the front and increasing artillery support. This combination of swift attack and careful defense showed that their joint efforts were effective even in the most difficult conditions. However, this first operation was not without difficulties and disagreements. At times, when Konev had doubts about the timeliness of the attacks, Zhukov insisted on maintaining the defensive line. Sometimes their views contradicted each other, which was reflected in the mood of the lower-ranking commanders. Nevertheless, these disputes always took place in a spirit of professional dialogue and a common interest in victory. Their alliance was built gradually, step by step, through tension and constant pressure from the front. The staff of each commander played an important role in their interaction, as did the communication system, which ensured coordination and transmission of orders in the chaos of military operations. Despite technical difficulties and disruptions, organization and punctuality in their work reduced the risk of misinterpreting commands and maintained the overall combat effectiveness of the armies. It was on this basis that the initial principles of their future cooperation were formed, which later became a model for the entire Red Army. In addition, the personal qualities of both marshals cannot be overlooked. Konev was distinguished by his openness and ability to motivate his subordinates and listen to the advice of officers and soldiers, which significantly strengthened the morale of the troops. At the same time, Zhukov, although more unyielding and demanding, inspired endurance and steadfastness by his personal example. The combination of these skills created a powerful foundation for successfully repelling the enemy's onslaught, inspiring not only the commanders, but the entire army. An important episode in the first clash between the marshals was the decision to entrust Konev's troops with the key responsibility for holding the strategic heights. This provoked a mixed reaction in Zhukov's headquarters, as the battle for the heights required maximum effort and sacrifice. However, the recognition of Konev's merits and competence was evidence of the growing trust between them. Ultimately, the successful defense of the heights significantly strengthened the position of the Soviet troops and pushed the enemy back, which became a turning point in the operation. Thus ended the first joint operation, which left a deep mark on the history of the Great Patriotic War and opened a new page in the rivalry and cooperation between the marshals. Their further actions would show how strong the bond between Konev and Zhukov would become, and what lessons they would learn from this difficult beginning. The details of these events and an analysis of the subsequent steps will reveal the final pages of their joint journey and pave the way for the grand victories that await us further on. The emergence of rivalry. The second half of 1942 was a turning point for two outstanding Soviet marshals, Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov and Ivan Stepanovich Konev. Amidst the fierce battles at Stalingrad and on the Mius River and the Miuskoye bridgehead, the rivalry between them began to take on increasingly clear contours. During this period, not only their professional ambitions became apparent, but above all, their desire for personal and political significance at the top of the Red Army. This was not simply a dispute over merits on the battlefield, but a struggle for influence, which was carefully assessed by the highest party structures. Already at the beginning of 1943, fierce battles on the Kursk Bulge allowed Zhukov to prove himself as one of the main strategists of the Great Patriotic War. His intelligence and determination earned him the recognition of both front commanders and Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin himself. At the same time, Konev achieved success in the liberation of Lviv and western Ukraine, demonstrating his skill in organizing tactical operations and the rapid depth of his offensive. Despite their shared love for their homeland, tensions gradually arose between the Marshals over the question of whose name would be more memorable in the history of the great victory. The political aspect of the rivalry took on particular significance. Zhukov, who was raised in the depths of Central Russia, was a man who had direct ties to Stalin himself. His participation in key Soviet operations was seen as confirmation of his loyalty and effectiveness. Meanwhile, Konev, a native of Kursk, represented a more diverse group of frontline soldiers who supported not only military tactics, but also social justice. It was these traits that created intrigue around their future careers. Which of them would become the face of the Soviet army after the war, and which would win greater support among party leaders? Having just completed the Battle of Prokhorovka, Zhukov received orders to prepare an operation to liberate Belgorod, where his genius for planning clashed with Konev's no less stubborn determination. At that time, Konev concentrated his efforts on a forced advance to the Dnieper, which required not only courage, but also the ability to work with limited resources. The intense exchange of information and constant comparison of successes made both figures the subject of close attention from the Soviet press, and historians trying to understand which of these commanders was more effective in the devastating tank battle. Against the backdrop of military achievements, it was impossible not to notice the hidden squabbles. Political intrigues surrounding the distribution of honors, long-standing merits, and promising career prospects in the civil service increasingly intensified internal tensions. This was particularly evident in the run-up to the Battle of Kursk, when decisions were made not only at the level of strategic maps, but also in the offices of senior party officials. Stalin's influence in the distribution of roles was significant, and both sides tried to win his favor, risking a lot in their game. Zhukov's ambitions were combined with cold calculation. He understood that victories at the front would not only earn him the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, but also the opportunity to influence the further development of the army. His methodical work with documents, reports, and analytical calculations demonstrated not only military skill, but also political intuition. Meanwhile, Konev, a less public but no less powerful strategist, relied on his direct connections in the army and showed an ability to adapt quickly to change. These qualities made the question of which of them was stronger a subject of heated debate among frontline soldiers and party leaders. The influence of their environment also played an important role in the emergence of rivalry. Zhukov was generally perceived as a man of dizzying military glory, which aroused envy and fear among his colleagues on the front lines. Konev, on the other hand, was a symbol of the People's Army. His name was associated with ordinary soldiers and officers, which made him more popular among the ranks. This contrast created a unique social backdrop against which the rivalry went beyond purely professional relations and entered the realm of public opinion and party politics. It is worth noting that it was during the final stages of the defense of Stalingrad and the beginning of a large-scale counteroffensive that both marshals felt a sense of the inevitability of the historical moment. The realization that the fate of the country and perhaps the entire world was now tied to their actions compelled them to seek new ways to prove their superiority. This soon erupted into public disputes over the choice of priority directions for the development of the front, as well as critical assessments of each other's decisions, which turned the struggle between them into something more than just military disagreements. The political elites of the TASS and Glavpur closely monitored every move made by Zhukov and Konev. Their reputations, instincts, and even personal inclinations became the subject of analysis in the highest offices of the Kremlin. At times, there were speculations about secret deals between the marshals and party leaders, unofficial agreements on the division of spheres of influence in the European theater of war. Such rumors, although not confirmed by documents, created an additional emotional background, stimulating the ambitions of both sides to expand their power and recognition. Personal characteristics also played an important role in the development of the rivalry. Zhukov, known for his demanding and tough nature, was not inclined to compromise and quickly rejected any attacks on his professionalism. Konev, on the contrary, was very diplomatic, skilled at smoothing over conflicts and negotiating with commanders and politicians. It was this combination of stress resistance and tact that made their confrontation both dramatic and intriguing, turning it into one of the most famous stories of World War II. It can be said that the rivalry between Zhukov and Konev arose at the intersection of military necessity and political calculation. The equality of their merits and ambitions was always reflected in the actions of both sides. Through a series of clashes and joint operations, they gradually created a picture not only of military competition, but also of a powerful alliance that became one of the main pillars of the Red Army's victory. The confrontation did not kill cooperation, but rather made it more intense and productive, which repeatedly saved the strategic position of the Soviet Union. The general mood at headquarters became more tense with each passing day, as the coming months promised to be decisive not only for the outcome of the war, but also for the fate of the two marshals. By the end of 1943, the rivalry was no longer a secret. Open statements about the priorities and significance of their operations became the basis for post-war legends. This mutual desire for glory and recognition filled their actions with a special drama that would develop in the following stages of the war. It was at this moment that a new stage in their interaction began: the transition from hidden rivalry to open competition for supremacy in post-war history. An era filled with turbulent battles and political changes paved the way for equally complex and important events, which we will examine further. As we continue to explore the fates of these legendary military leaders, we will see how their ambitions and talents intertwined in the fate of the great victory and the history of the country. Key battles and challenges. During the Great Patriotic War, Marshals Zhukov and Konev became not only key commanders, but also rivals whose paths crossed on the most important fronts. Their tactical decisions and personal influence determined the outcome of key battles, which often turned their interaction into a complex game of ambition and strategy. It was in this duel that the complex traits of both men came to the fore. Zhukov's unshakable will and Konev's desire for maneuver and surprise. One of the first major tests was the Leningrad front, where Konev's actions played a decisive role in breaking the blockade. His ability to adapt to harsh conditions, maneuver tank formations through swampy areas, and maintain the offensive in difficult terrain made his name legendary. However, Zhukov, who arrived later to help, introduced a more organized supply system and supported Konev with artillery firepower, which contributed to the success of the operation, but also highlighted the differences in the approaches of the U command. Returning to the Central Front, Zhukov actively developed large-scale offensive plans, paving the way for the liberation of the country's capital. His famous operation to liberate Moscow cost considerable effort and lives, but became a turning point in the entire war. At the same time, Konev, as part of the Kalinin Front, carried out maneuvers to provide flank support. This coordination was not without friction. Zhukov preferred direct confrontation, while Konev tried to use bypass routes, which sometimes hampered operational coordination. The Battle of Kursk was decisive, with both marshals fighting on different sections of the vast front. Zhukov commanded the defense, successfully employing a deep defensive strategy with multiple lines of fortifications and concentrated use of reserves. Konev, in turn, led the counteroffensive, managing to organize successful tank raids and ensure the rapid advance of Soviet troops. Despite their overall success, differences in methods and interpretations of the battle's results created tension in their relationship, which they sometimes tried to hide from the command. It should not be forgotten that both Zhukov and Konev made mistakes that repeatedly led to operational failures. For example, in one of Konev's raids, a significant amount of equipment and personnel was lost due to underestimating the enemy. Zhukov, in turn, risked concentrating too many forces in one direction, which allowed the Germans to find weak spots in other areas. These mistakes did not weaken their positions, but they added fuel to their personal rivalry and disputes over tactics. The relationship between the marshals could not be described as exclusively hostile, but it was not harmonious either. It was important for each of them to emphasize their importance and merits in light of the Army's successes. Personal participation in major operations, awards, and public statements sometimes served as an arena for demonstrating superiority, which did not always benefit the common cause. These nuances sometimes remained behind the scenes of official history, but documents and memoirs of contemporaries record the tension that accompanied their joint work. One of the most significant episodes was the liberation of Belarus, where they managed to play the highest symphony of military arts together. Zhukov was distinguished by his methodical approach and perseverance. He concentrated his forces and prepared for battle with iron precision. Konev preferred dynamic developments, and this combination ensured the successful encirclement of the Germans. However, behind the scenes, there were differences in approach, which sometimes led to disagreements about the assessment of the results and further steps. Against the backdrop of these events, the Battle for Warsaw once again demonstrated the ambition and will to win of both marshals. Konev sought to liberate the city quickly in order to demonstrate the strength and effectiveness of his troops, while Zhukov advocated a more cautious approach and thorough preparation. As a result, the troops went into battle under Konev's command, while Zhukov provided cover and strategic reserves. This division of roles sparked new discussions and debates, but ultimately changed the course of the war in the East. It should be noted that both marshals possessed an outstanding ability to adapt quickly, which helped them maintain leadership at the front. Their internal competition often became a driving force for the development of new strategic decisions and increased the overall effectiveness of troop management. En el contexto de estos acontecimientos, la batalla por Varsovia volvió a demostrar la ambición y la voluntad de victoria de ambos mariscales. Here, Zhukov and Konev became the directors of a grandiose scenario, where each of their mistakes could cost hundreds of lives. Their ability to accurately calculate and distribute forces was displayed in all its glory, and their variety of tactics allowed them to defeat the enemy. Internal rivalries and disputes over the plan only slightly overshadowed their joint achievement, but it was this achievement that laid the foundation for the triumph. In the end, it can be said that Zhukov and Konev were not only soldiers and strategists, but also participants in a complex spectacle of ambition, talent, and human weakness. Their rivalry came at a decisive moment in the war, and their influence on its outcome was unquestionable. Despite all their differences, it was the synthesis of their approaches that led the Soviet troops to victory, and these battles and mistakes will forever remain in the memory of history. Moving on to further consideration, it is worth paying attention to the influence of political intrigues and the high command, which also played a role in shaping the fate of these marshals and their relations in the post-war period. Politics and the army. Behind the scenes of popularity, politics and the army were inextricably linked in the Soviet Union, especially during the era when Marshals Zhukov and Konev were developing their rivalry. Their careers and relationships cannot be understood without taking into account the influence of party structures, which held the military apparatus in an iron grip. The party's top leadership regularly interfered in the affairs of the army, creating a field for ambition and the struggle for recognition. In this context, Zhukov and Konev were not just military commanders, but figures whose fame and successes were closely intertwined with political interests. The rivalry between them began at the end of the Great Patriotic War, when military merits began to be used as a tool for political influence. Konev, renowned for his originality and tough character, perceived Zhukov, who was more flexible and adapted to the party line, as a rival not only on the battlefield, but also in the Moscow party hierarchy. It was here, in the corridors of power, that real battles unfolded, far deeper than military merits. The support of key figures in the Politburo played a decisive role. Vasily Zhukov enjoyed the attention of politicians such as Laver Kaganovich and Nikita Khrushchev, which helped him quickly climb the career ladder and obtain command positions despite sometimes controversial decisions in battle. His ability to navigate intrigue and make long-term plans made him not only a talented commander, but also a skilled political player. At the same time, Konev experienced some limitations due to his more abrasive personality and tendency to express his own opinions. His outspoken stance did not always meet with approval from party leaders, which often slowed his career advancement. Despite this, Konev remained popular among the troops for his strict discipline and combat acumen. His team often saw the Marshal as a man of action rather than a schemer. The political role of the Soviet army was also evident in the way that famous marshals became objects of propaganda. Zhukov was widely used in the media as a symbol of victory, the embodiment of military valor and patriotism, which had a positive effect on his career. Konev, on the other hand, had to share the public's attention, which fueled tensions between them. Subtle hints of rivalry slipped into even official speeches and articles, creating a lasting image of competing heroes. Party structures did not always remain neutral, often preferring to support whoever was more convenient at the moment. This gave rise to a complex of mutual recriminations and distrust between the marshals, who, apart from their military duties, had personal ambitions. The struggle for influence in the political hierarchy intensified the rivalry, turning it into a game where not only military leadership skills, but also diplomacy and cunning were decisive factors. Another important aspect was the relationship with the Supreme Military Council, which controlled all strategic planning. Advice, directives, and party decisions influenced operational actions, which did not always coincide with Zhukov's or Konev's personal tactics. This created additional friction, as each marshal sought to prove his rightness and effectiveness. It was not uncommon for decisions on combat operations to be postponed precisely because of disagreements at the top, which repeatedly affected the overall dynamics of military operations. Thus, the political context was not merely a backdrop for the careers of the Marshals of Victory, but became an active element in them. Zhukov and Konev not only commanded the army, but also maneuvered in a complex system of party relations, where personal charisma and the ability to develop strategies gave way to the ability to build political alliances. This created a unique field for rivalry, in which military achievements went hand in hand with political maneuvering and influence over the authorities. Despite their apparent hostility, their relationship was based on a deep mutual respect as professionals. Both understood that their success depended not only on their combat skills, but also on the support of party structures. This awareness sometimes forced them to compromise, and sometimes to make difficult decisions for the common good. Each of them was, to one degree or another, a hostage to both their personal ambitions and the system in which they had to work. The importance of the political component in the development of their rivalry can also be emphasized by looking at the post-war period. During the years of the country's recovery and restructuring, the role of marshals changed, but Zhukov and Konev's political ambitions remained. National glory added weight to their words at party meetings, where the fate of reforms and military transformations was decided. The struggle for influence often went beyond the army and moved to the highest echelons of power, shaping the image of the Soviet elite of the time. Interestingly, despite a certain conflict, their political positions sometimes overlapped. Both marshals advocated strengthening the country's defense capabilities, modernizing the army, and reforms aimed at improving morale and professionalism. However, their approaches and methods for achieving these goals differed, which increased tensions and even provoked internal crises at times. Such disagreements gave rise to numerous rumors and speculations, which only fueled public interest in their figures. Similar nuances were reflected in how the Marshals built their relationships with the country's leadership. Zhukov paid closer attention to the political situation, trying to maintain a balance between military and party loyalty. Konev, on the contrary, emphasized strict discipline and personal responsibility among officers, which was sometimes perceived as a challenge to the party line. These differences show how difficult it was to be both a military leader and a political player in the Soviet system. Many sources note that the rivalry between Zhukov and Konev was often used for different purposes in party and state circles. One version suggests that their rivalry was artificially engineered to create the illusion of competition and maintain control over the army. While this theory has merit, it does not negate the reality of the conflict and its impact on the fate of both marshals. This complex mix of politics, ambition, and military strategy shaped a unique page in history. The mutual influence of political decisions on Zhukov and Konev's careers makes this story particularly interesting for detailed study. They were not just military strategists. Their fates were intertwined with the fate of the state and the ideological battles that took place behind the beautiful facades of the Kremlin and the Ministry of Defense. This aspect of their rivalry fills the story with vivid colors, bringing it closer to real life, where there is no place for unambiguous heroes or villains. In conclusion, it is worth noting that the political context was one of the main factors that shaped and sustained the rivalry between Zhukov and Konev. Their personal qualities, professional achievements, and ambitions formed a complex pattern in which each element played a key role. Understanding this dynamic allows us not only to more deeply appreciate the Marshals' contribution to the history of victory, but also to look at war and politics from an unusual and intriguing angle that connects the personal and the public in a single drama. This analysis paves the way for the next stage of our research, where we will examine in more detail the individual characteristics of each of the Marshals and how their charisma and character influence the history of the Great Patriotic War. Legends and myths surrounding their names. The rivalry between Marshals Konev and Zhukov is shrouded in numerous legends and speculations, which have given rise to a whole layer of rumors and conspiracy theories. Their names are often contrasted with each other, as if two giants of the Great Patriotic War were fighting not only on the front lines, but also in their personal relationships. Some sources claim that the rivalry between them was so intense that it led to conflicts at the highest levels, while others distort the facts, turning reality into drama for the popular audience. However, let's sort out where the truth lies and where the exaggeration begins. Zhukov and Konev were indeed exceptional figures, but their interaction was more like a complex game between allies than a fierce confrontation. Military historians emphasize that each marshal had personal ambitions, but the common goal, victory over fascism, always came first. Disagreements sometimes arose, but these were more likely due to strategic considerations and the distribution of resources than personal animosity. Rumors that Zhukov was jealous of Konev's successes and that Konev deeply resented Zhukov's abilities are not supported by documentary evidence. Written sources, memoirs of contemporaries, and archival materials point instead to mutual respect and professional recognition. Despite their rivalry, The two marshals often exchanged advice and supported each other at critical moments during military operations. Much of the misunderstanding surrounding their relationship arose in the post-war years. Political intrigues within the highest echelons of the Soviet government often embroiled the marshals in complex situations, but no direct conflict between them can be identified. Rather, each side had its own patrons and opponents, which sometimes created the impression of discord. The spread of rumors and fabricated stories contributed to the myth of eternal rivalry in the mass media. One interesting aspect was the question of command of individual fronts and the distribution of credit for decisive battles. Both sides sought to demonstrate the maximum efficiency and valor of their units, which led to healthy competition. However, no concrete evidence has been found that this escalated into personal conflicts. It was important to recognize their common goals, which only strengthened their military cooperation. Conspiracy theories about one marshal being destined to replace another, or attempts to remove them from office, are common in military history. But in the case of Zhukov and Konev, there are no grounds for such assumptions. Their relationship cannot be reduced to a simple struggle for power or influence. It was a complex blend of professionalism, ambition, and national necessity that allowed both figures to become symbols of victory. Some myths say that the marshals secretly competed for Joseph Stalin's attention and favor, but archival data suggests otherwise. Their relationship with the state leadership was based on respect, and many decisions were made taking into account the opinions of both commanders. There is no evidence of behind-the-scenes conspiracies against each other or complaints to higher authorities. The semiotics of Zhukov and Konev's images were often used for propaganda. One was portrayed as a fearless warrior, the other as a wise strategist. This further fueled the contrast, which gradually grew into a myth of rivalry. Despite the somewhat arbitrary nature of this division, historians advise viewing them in a comprehensive manner, since all victories were the result of coordinated efforts by the command. In the post-war period and in journalistic literature, there were frequent attempts to emphasize the differences between the marshals, sometimes with the aim of attracting the reader's attention or creating a dramatic effect. However, upon closer examination, it becomes clear that the main differences were not related to personal qualities, but to leadership style and tactical techniques, which is quite understandable given the scale of the war. Sources accusing Zhukov of excessive cruelty and disregard for Konev's opinion consider only isolated episodes, which are often taken out of context. In reality, both commanders sought to preserve the lives of their soldiers as much as possible and to do everything possible to end the fighting as quickly as possible. An important fact: many witnesses to those events emphasize that it was their alliance and combined experience that helped the Soviet Union escape from crisis situations and achieve victory. Characterizing the confrontation as a permanent conflict is unfair and distorts historical reality. It was more a matter of departmental disagreements and differences of opinion than full-scale hostility. Discussions of legends about a secret plan by one of the marshals to eliminate another should be considered fantasy and speculation, not supported by facts. Military service and the responsibilities entrusted to them ruled out the possibility of such actions without serious consequences. Other versions of history sometimes serve as a tool for political intrigue, or an attempt to belittle the merits of one of the heroes. A comparative analysis of documents and memoirs shows that Zhukov and Konev complemented each other in key operations. The strategic genius of the former was balanced by the pragmatism of the latter, which contributed to their success. Military chronicles make almost no mention of public conflicts, and if they do mention disagreements, it is exclusively in a professional context. Public perception of the conflict between the marshals is often oversimplified. There are versions that the battles of the Great Patriotic War were an arena for their personal struggle, that there was minimal trust between them. However, this view does not take into account the complexity of the political and military situation in which they operated together. It is well known that unresolved disputes and contradictions between high-ranking military officials are the norm in any large army. In this case, the tactics and methods of the team differed, but they were united by the idea of a common victory, which allowed them to overcome all obstacles that arose. Rumors often arise from a misunderstanding of these details and inevitably take on a dramatic form. Historical data show that Zhukov and Konev demonstrated a rare ability to compromise and adapt in conditions of constant tension. Their ability to unite their efforts and conduct military operations on a colossal scale speaks of professionalism and maturity, not insurmountable enmity. The results of their cooperation are evident in every major victory of the Red Army. Without this synergy, the Great Battle for Berlin and other decisive operations would not have been so successful. This proves that any portrayal of them as irreconcilable rivals is unfounded and serves only as a motive for sensationalism. Publications that fuel conflicts between Zhukov and Konev often forget the main thing. They were united by history, mission, and the fate of their country. Instead of stirring up controversy, it is more important to learn to understand the complexity of their relationship, the historical context, and the complexity of events. This allows us to assess each person's contribution without distortion. Thus, the myths surrounding their names are nothing more than the fruit of imagination, embellishing reality. An analysis of the facts reveals a much deeper and more harmonious picture, in which the marshals appear as symbols of unity and joint action. This is where the true meaning of their legacy lies. Before moving on to the next topic, we will see how the evolution of the images of Konev and Zhukov influenced the perception of history and the formation of memory about the Great Patriotic War. The legacy of the victorious Marshals Zhukov and Konev represented different styles and strategies. Zhukov was known for his determination, toughness, and epic offensive operations, such as the Battle of Moscow and the liberation of Berlin. His methods sometimes seemed harsh and uncompromising, but the results were clear. The most difficult breakthroughs on the front were made possible by his persistence and skill. At the same time, Konev showed great flexibility and attention to people, which gave his troops additional stability. Both men were involved in creating the modern post-war army, but with different emphases. Zhukov often advocated strict control and discipline, believing that this was the only way to ensure victory and order. Konev, on the other hand, paid more attention to training personnel, equipping troops, and modernization. Their rivalry within the Soviet military leadership reflected not only personal ambitions, but also ideological disputes about the future of the armed forces. In the post-war years, Zhukov's influence was so great that some of his enemies tried to limit his power. However, the memory of his victories did not fade. His name became a symbol of invincibility and courage, and numerous monuments and museums still remind us of his achievements today. He remains one of the most significant figures in the history of Soviet military affairs, and, in the popular imagination, a true hero and legend. Konev, although less expansive in public perception, also earned respect. His role in the liberation of Central and Eastern Europe and in the post-war reorganization of the army was no less important. His memory is kept alive both in Russia and in the countries where he helped restore peace after the horrors of war. His tactics and strategic thinking are still studied in military academies today. It is interesting to note that the heroization of these marshals sometimes ran counter to internal conflicts. Zhukov and Konev had differences that were reflected at the political level and in the army command. Their struggle was not just a conflict between two people, but a struggle between ideas and methods that shaped the post-war army and the influence of the USSR throughout the world. This left its mark on Soviet military doctrine. Despite the complex relationship between them, their alliance at critical moments helped make victory inevitable. Their mutual recognition of each other's talent and ability to work toward a common goal, even through struggle, demonstrated the strength of the Soviet military system. This legacy, which unites different views and styles, teaches us that success in military affairs depends not only on personality, but also on teamwork and adaptability. Today, the memory of Zhukov and Konev lives on in museum exhibits, history textbooks, and the memory of the people. Their names are immortalized in streets, military units, and even films and books. It is important to understand that the legacy of these marshals is not just the glory of the past, but a lesson for future generations who must remember the price of victory and the complexity of historical choices. From the confrontation between Zhukov and Konev, we can gain an understanding of how different approaches and philosophies of military art interact and compete. Their lives and careers are an example of how individuals influence the course of history, as well as how their memory becomes a subject of study and reinterpretation. Ultimately, their disputes and successes are woven into a single picture of a great era. Their legacy is not only strategic lessons and tactical decisions, but also human stories of courage, dedication to duty, and the complexities of command in wartime. This is what makes their role in history unique. Understanding the rivalry between the victorious marshals reveals deeper layers of the Soviet past and shows how the modern view of victory was formed. Moving on to the next figures of the Soviet era, we will see how Zhukov and Konev's legacy influenced the development of military affairs and politics in the post-war world. Their experience became the foundation on which new ideas and projects were built, and their characters continue to inspire researchers and military personnel to this day. Thus, their story opens the door to new fascinating topics and reflections.